Hello listeners. Welcome to another podcast on world history. Today I will talk about the rise of the Macedon, which falls under Macedonian Conquest. This content is about to describe Philip II's achievements and how he built up Macedon. So, let's get started. The rise of the Macedon. Philip II's conquests during the Third Sacred War cemented his power, as well as the influence of Macedon, throughout the Hellenic world. Background. In the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, Sparta rose as a hegemonic power in classical Greece. Sparta's dominance was challenged by many Greek city-states who had traditionally been independent during the Corinthian War of 395 to 387 BCE. Sparta prevailed in the conflict, but only because Persia intervened on their behalf, demonstrating the fragility with which Sparta held its power over the other Greek city-states. In the next decade, the Thebans revolted against Sparta, successfully liberating their city-state, and later defeating the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra, 371 BCE. Theban general Epaminondas then led an invasion of the Peloponnesus in 370 BCE, invaded Messenia and liberated the Helots, permanently crippling Sparta. These series of events allowed the Thebans to replace Spartan hegemonic power with their own. For the next 9 years, Epaminondas and Theban general Pelopidas further extended Theban power and influence via a series of campaigns throughout Greece, bringing almost every city-state in Greece into the conflict. These years of war ultimately left Greece war-weary and depleted, and during Epaminondas's fourth invasion of the Peloponnesus in 362 BCE, Epaminondas was killed at the Battle of Mantinea. Although Thebes emerged victorious, their losses were heavy, and the Thebans returned to a defensive policy, allowing Athens to reclaim its position at the center of the Greek political system for the first time since the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians' Second Confederacy would be Macedon's main rivals for control of the lands of the North Aegean. Philip II's accession. While Philip was young, he was held hostage in Thebes, and received a military and diplomatic education from Epaminondas. By 364 BCE, Philip returned to Macedon, and the skills he learned while in Thebes, coupled with his expansionist vision of Macedonian greatness, brought him early successes when he ascended to the throne in 359 BCE. When he assumed the throne, the eastern regions of Macedonia had been sacked and invaded by the Paeonians, and the Thracians and the Athenians had landed a contingent on the coast at Methanae. Philip pushed the Paeonians and Thracians back, promising them tributes, and defeated the 3,000 Athenian hoplites at Methanae. In the interim between conflicts, Philip focused on strengthening his army and his overall position domestically, introducing the phalanx infantry corps and arming them with long spears, called sarusses. In 358 BCE, Philip marched against the Illyrians, establishing his authority inland as far as Lake Arid. Subsequently, he agreed to lease the gold mines of Mount Pangaeon to the Athenians in exchange for the return of the city of Pydna to Macedon. Ultimately, after conquering Amphipolis in 357 BCE, he reneged on his agreement, which led to war with Athens. During that conflict, Philip conquered Potidaea, but ceded it to the Chalcidian League of Olynthus, with which he was allied. A year later, he also conquered Crenides and changed its name to Philippi, using the gold from the mines there to finance subsequent campaigns. Third Sacred War. Philip earned immense prestige and secured Macedon's position in the Hellenic world during his involvement in the Third Sacred War, which began in Greece in 356 BCE. Early in the war, Philip defeated the Thessalians at the Battle of Crocus Field, allowing him to acquire Pherai and Magnesia, which was the location of an important harbor, Pagazi. He did not attempt to advance further into central Greece, however, because the Athenians occupied Thermopylae. Although there were no open hostilities between the Athenians and Macedonians at the time, tensions had arisen as a result of Philip's recent land and resource acquisitions. Instead, Philip focused on subjugating the Balkan hill country in the west and north, and attacking Greek coastal cities, many of which Philip maintained friendly relations with, until he had conquered their surrounding territories. Nonetheless, war with Athens would arise intermittently for the duration of Philip's campaigns, due to conflicts over land and/or with allies. Persian influences. For many Macedonian rulers, the Achaemenid Empire in Persia was a major socio-political influence, and Philip too was no exception. Many institutions and demonstrations of his power mirrored established Achaemenid conventions. For example, Philip established a royal secretary and archive, as well as the institution of royal pages, which would mount the king on his horse in a manner very similar to the way in which Persian kings were mounted. He also aimed to make his power both political and religious in nature, utilizing a special throne stylized after those of the Achaemenid court, to demonstrate his elevated rank. Achaemenid administrative practices were also utilized in Macedonia rule of conquered lands, such as Thrace in 342 to 334 BCE. In 337 BCE, Philip created and led the League of Corinth. Members of the League agreed not to engage in conflict with one another unless their aim was to suppress revolution. Another stated aim of the League was to invade the Persian Empire. Ironically, in 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated during the earliest stages of the Persian venture, during the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander I of Epirus. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out other tracks as well. Show your love by hitting the subscribe button and do like, comment and share, to spread knowledge. See you next time. Till then, keep learning for fun.